On Sunday, November 24, 1971, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was preparing to take off with 42 people on board, including the crew. The Boeing 727 was scheduled to take off from Portland International Airport and land at Seattle International Airport with a flight of half an hour. On that very day, a legend would be born. A few days before Thanksgiving, on Sunday, November 24, 1971, the flight started at 14:50 and everything seemed normal. As the stewardess Florence was serving the man in the last row, seat 18E, she noticed that he was handing her a folded notepaper with a smile. Because of her profession, she was used to such incidents and flirtatious requests. In fact, she thought this was one of them. Smiling, he picked up the paper, but before he could open the note and read it, he threw it into his bag in the cabin. Then she went on with her duties on the plane. This stewardess was walking down the aisle asking people if they wanted anything, but as she passed the man at 18E, he stopped her and said in a voice that kept her calm, "Ma'am, you'd better look at this note. There's a bomb in my bag." Trying to remain calm in the face of what the man had said, Florence hurried to her bag and began to read the note. The note, written in all capital letters using a black felt-tip pen, read, "Ma'am, I have a bomb in my briefcase and I would like you to sit next to me." The stewardess was shocked. Although she did not sit next to him as he had asked, she leaned towards him and asked to see the bomb. And without any objection, and after making sure that no one was looking, he opened the briefcase and showed her what he was talking about. Indeed, 4 cylinders in 2 rows resembling dynamite and a battery were connected by wire. Florence was now convinced that the man's rhetoric was not a hoax, but she had to remain calm. The stewardess's astonishment was understandable, and in an overly calm and serene voice, the man began to explain his demands to her one by one. $200,000 of money in a single bag to be delivered by 1700 hours when they landed. 2 pairs of parachutes with spares, in total 4 parachutes, and that passengers other than the crew should not be aware of this incident. Yes, this is exactly what the man wanted. The stewardess, trembling in the face of the situation and taking notes, asked the man for permission to go to the cockpit to inform the pilots of the situation. The man, on the other hand, sat the stewardess, named Macklow, next to him and sent her to the cockpit to convey his demands to Florence. Meanwhile, some of the passengers were suspicious and tried to comprehend what was happening, but no one understood what was happening yet. The stewardess was next to the hijacker with the cabin phone in her ear, communicating with her cockpit companion and the pilots. The man's requests came one after the other and were transmitted instantaneously to the pilots. At the end of the already short flight, the pilots should have immediately requested refueling, no matter how empty the tanks were. Also, even if the plane landed, no one could get off the plane until the parachutes arrived. These simple demands, and of course the news of the hijacked plane, were communicated to the pilots, and by the pilots to the tower. On the ground, the scurrying and decision-making processes had already begun, and the plane was already circling over the airport where it was supposed to land, with the announcement that it would make a delayed landing. By the way, don't think of the kind of people we see in movies who hijack airplanes by shouting. Still, no one was aware of the situation except the crew. The man was making his demands in a gentle and calm voice, almost in a conversational tone. A man in his 40s, dressed in a black suit and white shirt with a tie and sunglasses, had arrived at the Portland airport in the afternoon, carrying a business briefcase, and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle. He had bought his ticket in cash and had written Dan Cooper in his own hand on the name tag. He sat in the back row of the airplane, ordered a drink and smoked a cigarette, and then, with all due courtesy, hijacked the plane and made his demands. The flight lasted about half an hour, almost 3 hours with people grumbling, and ended and landed around 1746. According to Dan's instructions, nothing was said to the passengers, but the crew complied with his requests and delivered $10,020 bills from the Federal Bank of San Francisco, or $200,000, each with a serial number, and the intact parachutes to the stewardess, who came down and delivered them to the stewardess, thinking that the hijacker would take a hostage with him. When the stewardess brought Dan Cooper's requests on board and showed that they were not lacking, it was time to free the passengers. When Dan allowed the passengers and 2 more stewardesses from the crew to disembark, only 2 pilots, 2 stewardesses and himself remained on the plane. The landing of these 2 stewardesses was also strange because, according to the testimony, the 2 stewardesses who landed said to Dan, "Can we get off too?" And he politely said, "Of course." That's the story, and they landed. Afterwards, the 4-man crew completed the fuel transfer as much as they could, even though the body was limping. And again at his request, and according to the statements given, he even asked for the plane to be lifted with a labile phrase like, "That's enough, let the show begin." He seemed to be in absolute command of everything, and he was telling the pilots in the cockpit through the macro where and how the plane should fly. He wanted to fly at the minimum possible airspeed of 185 kilometers per hour at a maximum altitude of 3,000 meters on a southeasterly route towards Mexico City at a maximum airspeed of 185 kilometers per hour with the landing gear on, flaps tilted 15 degrees and the rear door open. So all this information that he gave was definitely a qualification. But there was one thing that Dan Cooper missed. This small airplane could not fly to Mexico City without refueling with the disruptions experienced during refueling. Also, it was not possible to take off with the back door open. The captain, who conveyed this information to Dan, started to take off with the agreement they made. The rear door was to be closed on takeoff and opened in the air, and the aircraft was to make one more resupply at Reno Airport before arriving in Mexico City. When the flight took off at 1936, 3 other planes were in distant air pursuit of this hijacked aircraft. Sometime after takeoff, Dan Cooper learnt from the stewardess how to open the rear door of the aircraft and sent him to the cockpit with a warning not to come back. The last thing Stewardess Macklow saw as she entered the cockpit was Dan tearing one of the parachutes, stuffing the money into it and trying to tie it around his waist. That was the last sighting of Dan Cooper. And at the end of about 3 hours, the 4-crew Flight 305 landed safely at Reno Airport with the rear door open. There was no one except the crew in the aircraft with the door open, which was surrounded. Neither bomb nor hijacker was seen. All that was left were 2 parachutes, a tie with a black pin, the butts of the cigarettes he had smoked, 66 fingerprints thought to be his, and sketches created with the information provided by the stewardesses. The passenger, Dan Cooper, was never seen again. Due to the foggy and rainy weather, the tracking planes could not provide any information about a person jumping out of the aircraft or a parachute opening. A very large-scale search operation that would last until today was now fully underway. When the records started to be analysed based on the name, a man named D.B. Cooper, who had a minor criminal record in the past, became the first suspect. When the police raided the man's address, the police saw him sitting at home with his family, and when he managed to prove that he was at home all day, he was eliminated from the suspect list. But when the journalists carried this first suspect, D.B. Cooper, to the news in the morning, and when the same name was repeatedly misreported in the past days, Dan Cooper's name became a legend and remained D.B. Cooper. Since the entire cabin crew was in the cockpit when Dan jumped out of the aircraft, no one knew exactly over which location he jumped. I mean, it's not even clear that he jumped, but it had to be so. He was not on the aircraft. In order to evaluate all possibilities, flights were carried out 4 to 5 times with the same aircraft on the same rotation. However, even the smallest difference in the weather could easily change the landing location of a parachutist at 3,000 meters. Moreover, where Dan jumped was quite severe, and it was raining. The terrain was very difficult and snowy in parts. In the investigations carried out after the incident, teams of FBI agents, with the help of civilian volunteers, carried out another extensive ground search in Clark and Cowlitz counties, which were in the rotation of the aircraft for 18 days. There was no sign of Dan. Naturally, eyes turned to the serialized coins. After the mysterious escape, the FBI reported the lists of serial numbers on the bills to financial institutions, casinos, and other businesses that routinely conducted large cash transactions, and to law enforcement agencies around the world. That way, they would know immediately of any large expenditures and perhaps have a chance to catch Dan. However, with the passing time, there was neither money nor Dan Cooper. While the evidence collected still did not yield any results, Although tools made of stone and wood used by a person were found in one of the forests where the search was carried out, these findings could not bring them closer to the result. The difficulty of the situation was so severe that a $25,000 reward notice was even published for anyone who reported the use of money with these serial numbers. For the first time in the history of the FBI requested so much help from the public. The man was literally falling off the face of the earth. Until, about 10 years later, there was news. In 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram went hiking with his family on the Columbia River about 14 kilometers downstream from Vancouver, Washington, to a beach known as Tinnabar. But when the boy and his family dug up the sandy riverbank for a campfire, they found 3 packets of moldy coins worth about $5,800 in the sand and handed them over to the police. And yes, when the numbers of the coins were identified, it was seen that these were the coins containing those serial numbers. But I have bad news for the concentrated detectives who are listening to me. Although many theories, approaches, inferences, I can tell you, suspects have been put forward until today, nothing else on earth would be found about this man named Dan Cooper other than these coins. But there was a very important detail that experiments on the tires in which the coins were wrapped showed that these coins must have arrived there within a year, because the tires sampled could last a maximum of 1 year in these weather conditions and then turn to dust. However, the money found was relatively intact, which showed that the money had not arrived there on the day Dan fell, but had been buried there at some time within a maximum of 1 year. But he couldn't find out whether it was Dan or someone else who had done it, and he searched the area for months and months, and again there was no evidence. Dan Cooper had been missing for 10 years. When Dan jumped out of the aeroplane, he had no visibility of his location due to weather conditions, so he made a blind guess. In addition, the weather conditions were so bad that even if he had a plan to land in a specific place or to meet someone, it was not possible to do so when he jumped. No matter how competent he was, he could not even come close in those conditions, let alone hit the target. As in the video of the escape from Alcatraz, the FBI thought Dan died from his escape. But as I said, there was no evidence, no witnesses. From the plans he made and the information he gave, it was clear that he was a competent person. This suggested that he might have served in the Army or in the CIA, since the aircraft he had chosen had been used by government agencies such as the CIA. But not enough positive connections were found here either. When the stewardess asked him the reason for the hijacking, he evasively replied, "Your company's aircraft was in the right place at the right time, that's all." But of course this answer was not satisfactory. It was clear that he was prepared and had specifically chosen this flight. In fact, one of the biggest indicators of this preparation was that he left no evidence behind him except his competencies. Yes, he had written his name in his own handwriting on the plane ticket, but he showed how vigilant he was by even taking back the note he gave to the stewardess. In other words, he didn't even leave that note, because he thought that an inference could be made from his handwriting. His net DNA would never be accessed, because the collected cigarette services were somehow lost at the police station that received them, which was the single biggest record of his DNA. But it was also clear that things were not going well for Dan. Bad weather conditions, the fact that the parachute given to him was not a steerable parachute, the return of the plane to the supply point and not to Mexico City, bad terrain conditions, the money given in the form of 10,020 notes and the fact that they weighed about 30 kilos, there were many factors that made the plan quite troublesome. 50 years ago, for the first time in American history, a hijacking remained unsolved. Over the years, dozens of suspects were examined. 5 of them seemed to have a meaningful connection, but somehow a definite conclusion could not be reached. After that, the FBI had to close the biggest legendary inconclusive case in this history in 2016. In the last news about the incident in 2024, news began to emerge that the needle and clip of the pirate's tie played a very important role in analyzing his DNA. But it was said that the FBI had no intention of reinvestigating this evidence or giving it to volunteer scientists who wanted to investigate. What happened to Dan Cooper? Did he follow all the news about him somewhere with a smile? Or has he been looking for a dead man for 50 years, and somehow he still hasn't turned up?